The Long Island Railroad, LIRR, is the oldest railroad in the U.S. still operating under its original name and charter, having been founded in 1834 and commencing operations in 1836. The system had a ridership in 2024 of 83.78 million, making it the busiest commuter/regional railroad in the country. Ridership is the total number of trips made on a system in a given time period, counting each time the same person uses the system separately. The railroad is owned and operated by the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, or MTA. The MTA publishes lots of data to their open data portal, allowing people to use it in their own projects. In this study, I used the MTA's data as well as data sourced from other places to find out what causes delays in ridership trends on the LIRR. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of things, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more transit and rail content. Also, this is a friendly heads up that this is a semi-scientific study, so things will get very nerdy and technical very fast. If you want to skip to the results, use the timestamps below. To start, let's look at my hypotheses. For delays, I hypothesize that as the number of grade crossings and distance traveled go up, the number of delays also goes up. I also hypothesize that as you move from electrified lines to unelectrified lines, the number of delays go up. For ridership data, I hypothesize that as population density goes up, ridership also goes up, and that as median household income in an area goes down, ridership increases. Next, let's look at the methodology I used in this study. I started by overlaying the MTA's shapefile for trackage and stations onto the OpenStreetMap. I had to manually add 2 stations and 1 section of track as the dataset is not updated to reflect recent expansions. The trackage shapefile was not suitable for my needs, so I manually traced the trackage instead. I then added the locations of grade crossings, which came from a national dataset, so I had to cull everything not on Long Island. I then discovered that many of the points on the shapefile had as grade crossings were not actually grade crossings, and I therefore had to go through and manually check each point. There were also a few crossings that weren't in the dataset that I manually added all around Montauk. I then calculated the total number of crossings within a mile of each station using buffers, but because the delays data didn't pan out how I expected, this wound up being useless. I joined the station's shapefile to the ridership and other data for further analysis. I filtered the delays data to after February 27, 2023, as that is when Grand Central Madison fully opened, bringing with it a massive schedule change, and as such, using data from before then wouldn't work. I counted the number of delays and a rough estimate for the total number of trains from February 27, 2023 to early March 2025 in Excel, and used that to calculate the proportion of delayed trains. The estimate comes from counting the number of trains per week for each line using the current February 2025 timetables and assuming that the number of trains on each line has stayed relatively the same since February 27, 2023. I counted the number of crossings on each line and calculated the correlation coefficient for crossings to delays, followed by number of fare zones to delays to get a rough estimate of the correlation between distance from NYC and number of delays. For diesel services, I assumed all trains ran into Penn Station for simplicity's sake. The route into Penn Station has 1 fewer crossing than the route into Long Island City. Lastly, for delays, I assigned electrified lines 1 and diesel lines 2 and calculated the correlation coefficient for electrification to delays. I next used Landscan's raster data and the zonal statistics tool to calculate average population density around each station. From there, I calculated the correlation coefficients for different ranges around the stations. I visually noticed a correlation that was being obscured by outliers, so I removed them. 44.8% of stations were outliers, which means that the result without outliers should be taken with a grain of salt, and recalculated the correlation coefficients. For the remaining demographic information, I joined census data to the census block groups and used the intersection tool to select all block groups within 1 mile of each station. Using Excel's pivot table feature, I combined the data into 1 data point for each station. I then calculated ridership per capita and percentages for the demographic information in order to generate correlation coefficients. It is worth noting that stations on the city terminal zone, Penn Station, Grand Central Madison, Long Island City, Hunters Point Avenue, Woodside, Forest Hills, Kew Gardens, Jamaica, East New York, Nostrand Avenue, and Atlantic Terminal were excluded from all analysis due to all the stations being massive outliers, since these stations are all in dense areas and are where most people are going, leading to much higher ridership than the other stations. Additionally, Brentwood, Wyandanch, and Deer Park were excluded from analysis using census data, as no data exists for part or all of the 1 mile radius of those stations. One last point is that diesel services on the Port Jefferson branch are counted separately from electric services on that line. Now, for the fun part, the conclusions and results. We'll start with the delays data, as that was the original scope of the study. There's a strong positive correlation between the number of grade crossings on a line and delays, and between electrification and delays. What this means is that as the number of grade crossings on a line goes up, or as you move from electrified to non-electrified lines, the number of delays goes up. There is a weak to medium positive correlation between distance, measured as the number of fare zones the line crosses, and delays, meaning that as distance increases, the number of delays somewhat increases, but not to the same level as with grade crossings and electrification. Thus, I am 2 for 3 on hypotheses with this topic. Now, we'll move on to the conclusions and results from the ridership data. Starting with population density, I found a weak positive correlation between population density and ridership. However, I noticed that there appeared to be a trend in a sea of noise, so I removed outliers using the 1.5 times interquartile range rule, which resulted in roughly 44% of stations being removed due to being outliers. After running the analysis again on only the non-outlier stations, I found a strong positive correlation between population density and ridership. Since so many stations were removed due to being outliers, this result must be taken with a grain of salt. For curiosity's sake, I looked at the 3 biggest outliers to ridership and population density. For ridership, they are Ronkonkoma, Hicksville, and Mineola. This is due to these 3 locations being places that people want to visit, plus Ronkonkoma serves Long Island MacArthur Airport. The 3 biggest population density outliers are Flushing Main Street, Murray Hill, and Broadway, due to these 3 stations being located in a denser part of Queens instead of in Nassau or Suffolk County. The other demographic factors I looked at were gender, median household income, education level, race and ethnicity, and median age. I found a weak correlation between all of these factors in ridership, disproving my hypotheses on this subject. While this study was super interesting, there are some limitations that should be noted. The most important limitation is that there is not enough information and data to prove causation, which means I am not comfortable saying that the more grade crossings causes more delays. Instead, I will say that there is a correlation between the number of grade crossings and the number of delays. The second limitation is that the ridership data is an estimate generated by extrapolating ticket sales data. Additionally, each trip is counted twice in this data, once at the origin station and once at the destination station. Once again, the total number of trains is only a rough estimate based on the February 2025 timetables. Next is that the delays results are only valid to February 27, 2023, as that is when I cut off the delays data. It should also be noted that the census data comes from the 2019 to 2023 American Community Survey. The last limitation is that these results cannot be applied to any railroad other than the LIRR, as data for other railroads was not used in this study. Before getting to my data sources, I want to thank my professors for helping me and guiding me through this study. To visit the data sources, scan the QR codes that will appear on screen or use the links in the description below. The data for delays and the shapefile for stations came from the MTA's Open Data Portal. I also got a CSV that shows the official colors for each line in order to make my maps accurate. The U.S. Department of Transportation and the Federal Railroad Administration published the shapefile for the locations of grade crossings. Ridership data came from LIRR Today. The population density raster file came from Landscan. Census data is from IPUM's NHGIS. Lastly, the map backgrounds are from OpenStreetMap. Thanks so much for joining me in this look at the potential causes of delays and ridership patterns on the LIRR. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.